Welcome everyone. I'm Penny Lewis, Executive Director of the Ecological Landscape Alliance, and I'll be the webinar moderator today for Soil Amendments, What Works and What Should Be Avoided. This is one of the presentations we're offering in the Focus on Sustainability webinar series. This series was developed by a group of organizations known regionally for their quality ecological education. By collaborating on the series, the webinars help us to expand the reach of our organizations throughout the country. In case you're not familiar with our organizations, they're all nonprofit and largely volunteer groups in the United States. The regional groups are the Ecological Landscape Alliance, the Chesapeake Conservation Landscaping Council, the Midwest Ecological Landscape Alliance, and Eco-Landscape California. And now I would like to introduce our presenter, Mark Highland. Mark's interaction with the soil goes back to Illinois, to a farm when he was a young boy, and has continued throughout his life. Mark has a master's degree from the Longwood Graduate Program where he focused on compost and potting soil. After the Longwood program, he started the Organic Mechanic Soil Company in 2006. He has served as a consultant for the EPA and the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, and recently received the Young Professional Award from the Perennial Plant Association. Mark currently resides and runs his business in Chester County, Pennsylvania. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you, Penny, and thanks to everyone for joining us today for this webinar. So today we will be talking about soil amendments, of course. What works, what should be avoided. We do a lot of work in the city of Philadelphia and surrounding counties, surrounding areas. So the picture on the right-hand side is actually outside of 30th Street Station in Philadelphia, where all the soils there are organic mechanic soils. They contain a lot of the amendments we'll be discussing in this presentation. And the picture on the left, if you don't know, that's City Hall, Philadelphia, in Love Park. So this, according to an 8-year-old, would be what we would be without trees. So a rather stark world. Obviously, we certainly don't want to go down this path, and we all know that trees in the urban landscape are very important to us as landscape professionals as well as citizens of the planet. So just a little humor at the start of the talk for everyone. So in this presentation, we're talking about soil amendments. And we all need to be thinking about soil as a priority versus as an afterthought for construction jobs, for landscape maintenance jobs. There's never a better time to get the soil right than at the start of a project. I understand, like many of you, that in a lot of cases that soil is the last thing on the list. It's usually the first thing to get cut in a budget. However, I would argue, I'm sure many of you all would as well, that soil is vital to the long-term health and growth of any plant that's going in a landscape. These pictures are from my hometown, Westchester, Pennsylvania. Picture on the top left. Obviously, that oak has had plenty of room to grow. Even though there is impervious surface all around it, it's been given enough space. You all can tell, how old that tree is. It's been there at least 100 years. It's had plenty of room. The root flare is very exposed. Looks great. Just behind it, you can see the construction zone, which is where the pictures on the bottom are taken. And that was all just gravel, 2-4 gravel. No topsoil was put back after that project was done. You can see there's laydown materials there. And of course, that is also treating soil as a priority. That project, it didn't happen. And the end result, the trees were planted, and then in less than 2 months, the tree was cut back down. So and this didn't happen just in this one spot in Westchester. It happens all over our city, unfortunately. And I'm sure you all have seen situations like this. However, and the same thing, on the top right, there was definitely not enough room for that tree to grow. It's pushing up bricks all over the place. We really need to put some time into planning these landscapes and spend the time to convince the company or the person hiring you for the project that this is important. We need to address soil in the beginning to save money in the long run. If you have to just go back and replace the trees, we all know it's more labor, more time, more money. So if we treat it as a priority, we can keep those problems from happening. So next thing I'm going to talk about, I hope that everyone on this call has heard of James Urban and his book, Up by Roots, Healthy Soils for the Built Environment. If you haven't, I highly recommend you buy that book when we get off the call today. Phenomenal book. James Urban's done a lot of work in this space looking at tree health, and has shown through many projects over and over it's directly related to the volume of soil available in the root zone. And while I'm not going to go into detail about structural soil or the silvacells that James Urban recommends today, I'm just kind of mentioning that these things exist. They are absolutely important for the urban landscape and even suburban landscape. They can be used. As James Urban has shown through his research, silvacells will result in bigger trees simply because there is more soil available. Now, structural soil, if you don't know, that was developed at Cornell University. It's a lot of larger particle materials, rock essentially, stone, very little topsoil in that mix. And the silvacells are designed to be primarily all topsoil, no stone needed. You have the structure from the essentially plastic cages that go in underneath sidewalks, etc., so that they can compact as they're supposed to, but the soil is not actually compacted. So not going to go into detail about those, just saying they do exist, absolutely part of the urban landscape and landscape design. So we're definitely going to talk about modifying existing soil today. We're going to be looking at soil amendments that do modify the root zone in beneficial ways. But again, the number one factor to success, tree health, tree growth, is the soil volume in the root zones. When you look at soil remediation on existing landscapes and looking at soil amendments, what works, I personally recommend and firms that go with these methods. When you're talking about core aeration and vertical mulching, radial trenching, as opposed to more invasive methods, these are the methods that I see being the most successful in the landscape. Highly encourage vertical mulching to go beyond the drip line, since roots are at that point, especially feeder roots, and they'll only continue to go that way. It doesn't make sense to me to stop at the drip line. I know a lot of publications say just go to the drip line. I would encourage to go beyond, because that sets that tree up for success in the future. As far as how far to go beyond, that is going to depend on the site, the tree species, and other conditions. And that's a judgment call to be made individually, site by site. Certainly you want to backfill with a blend of porous material and or fertilizer, again, depending on tree species and environmental conditions. Most of the time it is compost or a mixture of compost and sand, perhaps with some fertilizer mixed in. I would also postulate that biochar be considered in this backfill blend. So the whole goal, if you don't know, is to increase water percolation, to be zones for roots to grow into, to get more air, and to break up compaction in these landscapes. Air spading around tree trunks, also important method for soil remediation for dealing with stressed urban trees. You have to investigate, of course, to find out, are there girdling roots down there? Sometimes it may not be the soil problem, it may just be the tree was planted too deeply in the beginning. And so important to, air spade can be a good tool to identify what is the real problem here. Tips for air spading: if you've never used an air spade before, They're a wonderful tool, but you should irrigate the soil a couple days before work begins. That just decreases the amount of dust present when you are air spading. Ideally, you'd relocate any landscape plants that might be affected or injured by the work. You certainly can set up plywood as a wall behind the air spading area so that when you're blasting soil, it just hits that plywood and then drops to the ground. That can help limit your disturbance area. And of course, you're going to expose between 6 inches, 18 inches, depending on the intended modification. As always, with anything like air spading, safety first, and all protective personal equipment should be worn to protect yourselves. So we're going to go over soil amendments to improve root zone conditions. Soil amendments we're going to go over today are bulk amendments for modifying soil conditions. So you've got your compost, aged pine fines, worm casting, sand, and biochar. These are the 5 major ones I'm going to cover today. I'm not going to cover fertilizers, mineral or otherwise. And I realize that in the lexicon there are many companies that call things like green sand or oyster shell flour or any of these other mineral components. They might be referred to as soil amendments in a loose term, which is true. You are adding material to the soil. You are amending the soil with these ingredients. However, that can be more appropriate when you look at nutrient content in soils. What do trees need to thrive in soil? What kind of fertilizer do they need? There's a lot of variables there, but for the purposes of this talk, we're going to stick to soil amendments that are bulk amendments for changing physical properties and potentially even biological and chemical properties of soil. We're not going to talk about fertilizers here at this talk. It'll be another talk for another day. But we will go over all these ingredients in general. And if you're curious, that's a picture of Caryopteris grown in a peat-free potting soil. Caryopteris roots after 3 years. So the first one we're going to go over is compost. I know that everyone's familiar with compost. I doubt there's a single person on this call that hasn't used compost, whether at home or in a landscape at this point. So for each of these ingredients, we're going to list pros and cons. Of course, pros of compost are increased biological content. Compost has a fantastic water and nutrient holding capacity. It will also add buffering capacity to a soil. And the pH is usually alkaline. Certainly you can find composts that are a bit closer to neutral. However, most composts are on the alkaline side. And that can be a pro or it could be a con, depending on where you are. I understand that those of you that might be in the Midwest, where your pHs are naturally a bit higher than those of us here on the East Coast, or maybe out in California, you may have an alkaline soil already, so in that case, it would be a con, actually. But you could use the next one we're going to talk about, which is pine fines. So cons is that source quality does vary, and that is a matter of really having conversations with suppliers. What is your compost made from? Do you screen it? How long is it composted? How do you turn it? To find out, is this compost going to be full of weed seeds, or did they compost correctly to make sure there are no weed seeds present, or potential plant diseases if it's a yard debris type compost that you're using. Because if that compost does not get the correct temperature and processed commercially, there's a good chance that you'll still have those detrimental things, weed seeds and plant diseases present. There are different ways for managing compost piles to ensure that those conditions are met, to eliminate those pathogens and weed seed. In general, a compost operator or supplier should be able to answer any question that you have about the compost. I would also encourage you to ask for a compost test result so you can see what nutrient content you're getting, what pH you're getting. They may or may not have biological test results available. Certainly it never hurts to ask. There is the Soil Food Web which I'm sure some of you know, that can do biological testing. There's also other companies out there that do biological testing as well. Also, product is going to oxidize over time, so that can be considered a con, a negative, basically saying that, hey, don't forget, if you mix in 50% compost, not that anyone would, but if you mix in a lot of compost to a soil, that compost is going to oxidize and the soil level will shrink over time, which is why, generally speaking, for a lot of jobs, 10% is the uppermost limit for compost addition to soil, so you don't get a whole lot of volume loss over time. Aged pine fines is going to be the next one that I talk about. And if you are listening in from the West Coast, you of course have fir bark. We have pine on the East Coast for paper, for lumber, and I know on the West Coast you guys have Doug fir primarily. So that would be your replacement. They're very similar since they are both conifer bark. But pine fines, they're fantastic for increasing your fungal content soils because it is adding long-term cellulose, longer-term cellulose as lignin. pH is usually acidic, which again could be a pro, could be a con. You use them to your advantage when you need to swing soil pH a certain way. Aged pine fines generally will also have a larger, but not always, have a larger particle size than, say, compost. That's relatively standard. Pine fines, generally speaking, are screened to approximately 3/8 or 1/2 inch, 3/4 inch. So ideally it's the fines, and they have been aged. However, one of the cons, source quality varies. So even if you have a supplier that you've bought from for years, if there are disruptions to their supplies, you may end up getting a load in of fresher pine bark as opposed to aged pine bark. Pine fines, pine bark is a commodity item, so this kind of things happen. You should have an open dialogue with your pine bark supplier if you are buying this product to make sure that you're not caught by surprise if you get delivered a load of much more raw product as opposed to the aged product that we're all used to, that we want. Same thing, because it's organic material, it's going to oxidize over time. Generally speaking, aged pine fines are bulk shipments only. Certainly for smaller jobs, you can always go to pick up 2 or 3 cubic foot bags of this stuff at your local supply store. Generally speaking, you're talking about bulk shipments because you need larger amounts for amending bulk landscapes. So worm castings are another ingredient. The amount that you'd be applying is certainly much less than a compost. University studies show that you only need approximately 3% to get a significant difference in plant growth. There are jobs where only 1 or 2% are going to make a difference in plant growth. The main reason for adding worm castings to a soil are to increase the soil biological content. You'll also be introducing additional buffering capacity when you use worm castings. The pH is usually neutral. And then on those pros, the biological content, in case you did not know, generally speaking, the biological subset of organisms that's in worm casting is different than that you would find in a general compost. There are certainly differences within the abundance and diversity of microbial activity in different composts depending on the source material. The same is true for castings. The abundance and diversity of biological organisms is different from worm castings to compost. So I like to think of worm castings as a complementary subset of biology, because the more diverse and abundant your soil biology is, the less susceptible you are to pathogens and other problems in the root zone. Another con, just like the first two ingredients, is that source quality varies. It depends on who's making it, how they're making it, what they're feeding the worms, how long those worms eat that food. Are they cutting the worm castings with something else? Some suppliers do that. So it pays to know your supplier, buy a small amount at first to make sure it's the quality that you want before you start ordering large quantities. Same thing, the product does oxidize over time. However, it's not as fast as, say, compost or pine bark, but it will still oxidize and break down over time as the castings break down and start to be absorbed and eaten by other microbes, etc. So a lot of nutrient content in worm castings, comparatively usually higher content than compost, so something to take into account as well as you look at the bigger picture of what nutrients is this landscape going to need as well. And the only way to know what nutrients you need in a landscape is to start with a soil test. That should be the first line item in any new project. Get the soil test done first to know what you're working with before going any further with soil amendments, planning for remediation, planning for fertilizers. It's always good to know what you're starting with. So sand is another bulk amendment. Sand has been used more and more in stormwater soils, rain garden soils. You're getting the drainage factor from these sandy soils. Because this is a picture of 3 millimeter sand. This is the sand that we prefer. Same size sand used at Longwood Gardens for all major construction projects, including the main fountain garden, which is undergoing remediation right now. In many areas of that soil, they're actually using an 80% sand, 20% topsoil mix. And that certainly can be appropriate for well-drained soils to deal with stormwater, etc. However, one luxury that Longwood has, which many public landscapes do not have, Longwood also will be installing irrigation on all those plants. If you have a public landscape and you're installing a stormwater soil with 80% sand, there's a good chance if you have a major dry spell in summer that those plants are going to suffer. Because 20% soil, going back to James Urban's rule of soils, is that's not a whole lot. 20% topsoil is not a whole lot. And the more soil there is, the bigger the trees can grow, the faster the trees can achieve their mature size. So certainly important tool to have sand for certain projects, because there are certain projects where it's absolutely going to be the answer to increase drainage and increase water percolation. The pros, it's permanent. It's not going to biodegrade. It's there for life. And generally speaking, pH neutral. So some of the cons are it's bulk shipments only, and it's very heavy material. However, it can certainly be very valuable when needed. So now we're going to talk about biochar. So after we go through this slide is when we will take the first round of questions. So if you've been holding back, please do type in your question now, and Penny will relay that over to me after we've gone through this slide. But as an introduction to biochar, if you don't know what biochar is, it's essentially pure carbon created by heating organic materials, usually wood, but not always, in the absence of oxygen. You're burning off everything flammable, and then you're stopping the process, and what's left over is the pure carbon, biochar. So biochar will increase water and nutrient holding capacity. It certainly will increase soil biological content over time, because biochar is essentially a home to microbiology. And again, I'm hoping that many people on the call are somewhat familiar with biochar, in that if you look at an electron microscope of biochar, you're going to see space, surface area, where things have been burned away, and left in its place are all these micropores, channels, think xylem and phloem tubes that have been released of all the inner properties. So microbes can get right in there, bacteria, fungi, protozoa, nematodes, you name it. They can get in, they can set up shop, they can make it their home. And then there's also the liable compounds that are readily available that these microbes can eat. However, biochar is a permanent addition to your soil. Now, biochar goes back to the terra preta soils of the Amazon. That's where this technology was rediscovered about a decade ago. There's been a lot of research done on biochar. Some of that research focused around just physical properties of soil. And it is absolutely true. Biochar will increase drainage and help break up compacted soils. Biochar is permanent. As I said, you add it, it's there for life, especially in terms of a human lifetime. The terra preta soils in the Amazon were carbon dated, shown to be over 2,000 years old, and the stuff is still there. So not only that, but the USDA research showed that these terra preta soils in the Amazon are so incredibly unique that they were only 92% similar to existing soil in the same regional area as these biochar soils. As a reference, human beings are 98% similar to members of the ape family. So to have a soil that is 92% similar shows that there are great differences between biochar enhanced soils and the surrounding native soils. Granted, those soils are 2,000 years old. However, the research shows that biochar will increase plant growth and positively impact the soil profile. In addition, biochar sequesters CO2 in the ground. So that certainly should be part of our climate strategy going forward. So it's a nice bonus that we're putting CO2 in the ground. Biochar is going to add buffering capacity. Biochar has both positive and negative sites on it, so it's got great cation exchange capacity. It also has anion exchange capacity. The pH of biochar is usually alkaline, which goes hand in hand to my first con, that source quality is going to vary. So the pH of the biochar is going to depend on a lot of things: how it's made, what it's made from, how long the process goes on for. Because essentially when you burn wood, we all know you're going to be left with carbon and ash. And so the more ash that is present generally means higher pH. So if you're looking for biochar, generally speaking, you want to look for one that has a lower ash content and higher carbon content. So source quality will vary, and you absolutely should be looking at the pH of biochar to determine, is it closer to 8 or is it closer to 11? We've seen biochars all over the map. At this point, we've probably been contacted by every biochar supplier in the U.S. And there's a lot of high-quality biochar out there regionally around the country. So I know that people have called in from all over. You're going to find good stuff. You will have to look for it, though. Bulk shipments only for biochar, generally speaking, unless you find a local source. It does require a pre-inoculation process for best results. Biochar needs to be moistened. It needs to ideally have some minerals added to it, some nutrients. It needs to be, we like to say the biochar is like a battery. You have to charge it up before it can release back to the soil or to help out plants. So the pre-inoculation process, we'll talk more about that in coming slides. So at this point, we're going to take some questions, and then we'll go from there.
All right. Thank you very much. The first question is, do you know of any study that shows the effect of biochar on the sequestration rates of plants, or is that something that you're going to talk about in the next half of the presentation?
I will talk a little bit about that in the next part of the presentation. And to understand, make sure I understand the question, research showing if biochar impacts sequestration just within that tree.
Right.
And right. So there are. So for example, if you don't know about iTree, it's just ITRE. That is. And I apologize, I don't know how far it goes. I was recently at a presentation where they talked about it. So iTree, you can go online and look at various trees, districts, etc., you can see the exact amount of CO2 sequestered by tree species, whether or not the biochar is there or not. So when I say you're sequestering it in the ground, you are putting CO2 in the ground. That's the biochar that's going, the carbon that's going in the ground. And then, the faster that tree grows, the more carbon you're sequestering in the tree. So it's going to go hand in hand. The exact amount is a more complicated algorithm, but there are resources out there to give you that data.
Okay. Next question is, what are your thoughts on peat moss as an amendment? Is it no longer a sustainable or responsible option, or are there some situations where it would be appropriate?
Sure. So, peat moss, if you do a little digging, you'll see that Organic Mechanics is a peat-free potting soil company. We did that for a number of reasons, but if we just look at, peat and its use in the landscape, peat has some of those same cons that I listed earlier in that it oxidizes quickly, it's going to break down, and then that's going to change the physical properties of the soil. Certainly, peat is very acidic, but I would argue that you can use pine fines if you need acidity. You could also use, on the other coast, perbark if you need acidity. There's other granular things you can add as well. Sulfur pellets are good for decreasing pH if you need to lower pH. You can also use things like, aluminum sulfate, iron sulfate, but if you need to bulk amend soil and you're looking to drop pH, I personally like pine fines better. Pine fines also give you more fungal biology. Peat moss is, by and large, devoid of beneficial biology. There's not a whole lot of nutrients to it either. For many of us, peat has to travel a long distance to get to you, so that doesn't make it as carbon friendly. However, there are certain landscape instances where it absolutely should be considered for use. And I mean in situations where you have ericaceous plants, azaleas, rhododendrons, blueberries, anything in that family that must have a lower pH. It may be appropriate to consider that if you don't have access to something like pine fine. So there's that. Two sides to the coin. The sustainability of it, we could have discussions about that. It's kind of a whole other topic. But just from a performance standpoint, it's going to break down faster than some of these other ingredients. Certainly it is readily available in some parts of the country, the closer you get towards Canada. But for many of us, I think that there are other options that do a better job.
Okay. The next one is about worms and the worm castings that you mentioned. Since worms are invasive in many parts of the country, are worm castings a potential problem?
So it's a great question. It's one I answer all the time. A good worm casting supplier will screen out all worm eggs. And that way you are not introducing worm eggs into a new built environment. Those of you who are working on projects in adjacent to forested areas, estates, properties where they butt right up against natural areas, certainly worm casting should be used very sparingly in that regard. I would switch more to like a bulk compost. Compost is going to be a lot more economical than castings. Worm castings are generally for high-end jobs where performance is going to be very important. Jobs where there won't be any issue with the surrounding area. But the big thing is that most suppliers screen out they want the egg because that's their livestock. I mean, they don't want to like give you their livestock. They want to keep it because they need them. So they're generally all screened out. And yes, worm castings, there's research that shows that they do attract worms to them. So that could be a pro, that could be a con, again, depending on the landscape itself. So yes, every site is unique. Every site deserves all these questions to be asked. What's going to be the best amendment for this site given the conditions of the site? So hopefully that answers your question. Feel free to follow up with another one if you want.
Okay, thank you. What about your thoughts on shredded leaf mulch that have been aged at least one winter, and your thoughts on the type of leaves and how they will affect pH?
Sure. Shredded leaf mulch is a fantastic amendment. It's not widely available. However, you may be fortunate enough to have great supplies near you. Leaf compost can be phenomenal. It generally has a higher pH. For example, I did my master's thesis at Longwood Gardens, and there's a space in the garden called Pierce's Woods, and they added leaf mold. They would take all the leaves, compost them all winter, and then they'd put them out in the next spring. And they put this leaf mold down, this leaf compost down. I like to call it leaf mold because compost to me is a very particular set of processes that have to go on to make the product. Otherwise, you're just aging organic matter, right? So, but leaf mold used in Pierce's Woods year after year for a decade raised the pH of the soil in that environment. They then switched to aged pine fines, started using that, and they saw after a period of years the pH started to come back down again. So you'll have to watch that drift over time. But in general, compost made from leaves can be wonderful stuff. Different composts are going to add different physical properties. They will add a slight difference in nutrients. Certainly a farm-based compost that has manure in it is going to have more nutrients than, say, a leaf-based compost. So there's variability within that. The beautiful thing about nature and biology is that, by and large, the biological components in compost are similar. There's always going to be some differences, but they're similar whether you're using leaf mold compost, farm-based compost, yard debris-based compost. It's a wonderful thing that nature will, the compost process continues no matter which of those you're using. The only other thing to watch out for with leaf-based compost is that just because your local municipality has it for free, that doesn't mean that they actually composted it. It could have just sat in a pile, weed seeds could have blown in all over it, and then you're getting what you think is a wonderful leaf compost, and then a month later you're dealing with thousands of weed seed. So it's just something to consider. That's not to say it's not going to happen everywhere, but it could happen.
How long do pine fines need to age before you avoid sucking nitrogen away from the plants for the nitrification process?
Yeah, that's a great question. We look for suppliers that age for a minimum of 8 months. That should be long enough for that pile. Number one, that pile is going to heat up on its own because these are made in facilities where they have massive piles of pine bark. This will definitely be turned a number of times in that time frame. You notice on the slide it said aged pine fines or Doug fir fines. It doesn't necessarily mean that they were composted. However, most instances you're hitting those temperatures that are going to knock out weed seeds, etc. So as far as pine, how long does it need to go? The longer the better. I would say look for 8 months. We do know that some suppliers, even though they might say aged pine fines, and maybe you've been getting decent aged pine fines for years, all of a sudden you could order a load and it comes in really fresh. Because technically, if the line item just says aged pine fines, well, technically if they aged it 2 days, it's aged, right? And so that's a conversation to have with suppliers, make sure everybody's on the same page. But yes, it needs to be a minimum of, even 4 to 5 months would be the absolute minimum for the biological and structural changes to take place so that things are breaking down, they're aging to be more beneficial in the root zone. But we look for 8 months.
All right, thank you. We're going to wrap it up for now and let you go on with the rest of the biochar, and we'll take a few questions at the end.
And those are some great questions. Very much appreciate the involvement there. So thank you for that. A few more questions than I might have thought, but that's okay. We still have plenty of time to go through this. I'm sure some of you on the call do know a bit about biochar, but basically, again, it's highly porous charcoal or carbon made by pyrolysis. No, you can't grab that bag of cowboy charcoal you have for cooking on the grill and break it up into biochar. Not the same thing. You know, they stop the process of making charcoal when there's still flammable materials present. That's because you want it to burn nicely on your grill. Those flammable materials will are not beneficial for plant growth. You know, there's a reason why you have to have this inoculation process that I talked about earlier, and that's so the microbes can get in and break down any remaining resins that would be present that would be detrimental to plant growth. Biochar properties change, whether it's made low temp, high temp, or gasification. So that's something just to be aware of. You know, like I said, source quality varies depending on what it's made from, what temperature it was made at. There's a lot of variables there, how they treat it when it's done being made. But it is stable carbon to mix into the soil, has excellent adsorption properties. Like I said earlier, cation exchange capacity. It also has anion exchange capacity. Biochar has been shown over and over to increase yield and plant health. And a general rule of thumb is that 1 ton of biochar can sequester up to 3.5 tons of CO2. So that's saying, hey, if you burned the 1 ton of biochar, then you'd be releasing that much CO2 into the atmosphere. And that was data that came from a Cornell graduate student that I heard at a 2009 presentation of the International Biochar Conference at UMass Amherst. So just a real quick visual. So this is a TLUD called a top-lit updraft stove used in developing countries where smoke inhalation is a problem in the homes. These were developed to burn fuel cleanly, not produce a lot of smoke, because there's not a whole lot of smoke when you're making biochar, because you're actually burning the smoke as a secondary combustion source. And so there's very little smoke going into the atmosphere when biochar is made properly. So this biochar burn is happening. You can see it's starting to slow down, which means all the flammable materials have disappeared. At this stage in the game is when, okay, everything flammable is gone. You're left with mostly pure carbon. Now would be the time to stop this burn, right? So biochar does need to be inoculated for best results. And microbial inoculation is going to enhance the quality and can help reduce any lingering plant toxic compounds, as I said. And also mentioned, it is like a battery, has to be charged in order to work properly. There are different inoculation methods. In general, you're mixing it with things that have a lot of biological activity, compost, worm castings, and then nutrients can be added as well. So biochar on the far left, if you're looking at raw biochar, after it comes out, there's wood waste, wood scrap that was charred. The middle one has the ground material, so you're breaking it down. As you break it down, you're increasing surface area. As you're increasing surface area, you're increasing the performance value of that biochar. And then on the right, the super mix, and that's been mixed with compost. And in this case, they're using a 50-50 blend and then applying the mix out on their farm fields. So there are some companies that are blending biochar with nutrients only. Certainly will work. However, that biochar, it is like a battery. If you put raw biochar in the ground, plant performance will suffer, at least for the first year, because that biochar is being charged up with water, nutrients, and biology. So if you put it in the ground, sans biology, it's just going to take longer for the biology to get in and set up residence. You won't see as many of the plant health benefits the first year. However, as long as you're blending it with nutrients, then you shouldn't see any yellowing due to the addition of biochar or decrease in yield. So let's see here. All right, okay. So research has been done. This one is talking about USDA ARS research, again, that was presented at that Biochar conference in 2009, but those USDA studies show that biochar could reduce nitrogen leaching as much as 40%, phosphorus leaching as much as 70%. Biochar does better in poor soils. So the worse the soil is, the more benefit you can see from biochar. The better the soil initially is, you're not going to see as much of a gain. Okay, so these two rates, they were talking about biochar research done on sandy soils in Virginia along the coast. Still researching optimum field application rates, suggested 2 ton per acre minimum, 45 ton per acre maximum, mainly farming. However, the effective rate in the soil by all current standards is about 5% biochar by volume in the soil. Lesser rates are still under research. The current maximum rate that almost anyone is recommending is 10%. That becomes the law of diminishing returns. You don't need anything more than that. You're not necessarily going to get more value out of it, and biochar is not cheap, so you want to put in the right amount to get an effective increase in growth and yield. So that's 5%, and that's research that we have seen from all over the country. So this is just 4 studies that were done showing the effects of biochar on plant growth from a variety of sources. That first one was done at the Morton Arboretum. There's a great write-up on their website. You can go find that if you jot any of this down. All great studies. We've done our own research, and the pictures that you see in the top left, that's what we call our root zone feeder pack. So that's biochar, but it also has a dose of mycorrhizae. It has oyster shell azomite, and you can see the roots are just growing through that biochar pellet. I mean, they're just going nuts. The same thing with the middle picture. And then I realized these are peppers and tomatoes, but you can see the difference with without having biochar in the potting soil for these 2 examples. So, but there's a lot of research out there on biochar. A lot of the research will show no significant difference, no benefit. I would argue as a scientist, go back, look at the study, what kind of char did they use? In a lot of cases, they're using raw biochar. And it's been shown over and over, if you use raw biochar, you're not going to have good results, especially in the time of a research trial, unless that trial is long-term, and then in the long term, you would see it. But it all comes down to the source. Were they using biochar with a pH of 11? Were they using a high ash? You really have to look at the source and look at the data. There is a lot of research showing biochar does have positive impact on plant growth. For those that are familiar with Bartlett Tree Experts, they've done long-term studies at their facility showing all kinds of benefits in plant growth from biochar additions to soil. And generally speaking, they're going with that 5% rate as well in a lot of those trials. So a lot of research out there. If you do some digging, you can find quite a bit. So making biochar on a larger scale, if you want to mess around at home or for your company, it's a good way to stand around a fire in winter, keep warm, hey, make hot chocolate on it, whatever. But double barrel retort, if you throw that into Google, you're going to get a lot of hits on people that have made these. You can see them in action. But the general gist is you have a 30-gallon container that goes in a 50-gallon drum. You fill the 30-gallon drum with your charring material, whether it's wood pellets or landscape debris or wood chips, whatever it is. Whatever you put in there needs to be very dry, extremely dry. You don't want hardly any moisture in there, because otherwise the fire has to spend more energy driving off all the moisture before it can start creating the char. Then you're just using too much energy to actually make the char. So the material you're trying to char in the 30-gallon drum needs to be dry to start with. So you can see some of the other parts and pieces that are on there for good airflow, good draft, to make sure that fire runs hot with very little smoke coming out of it. So that's more of a home version. A little bit larger version, when you talk about a company called New England Biochar, they have this Atom retort that's been on a trailer. You can do about a half a yard char per batch. There are other larger units, but really this is just making the point that this is actually at that same conference with it, but it's just making the point that there are larger units out there. They do exist before going to the full-blown giant warehouse scale models There are good machines out there that can do a fair amount. And this thing was so unique that all you really had to do, once it was full of material to be charred, you really just had to light a paper plate on fire, or something small, one piece of newspaper, put it in there, and the whole machine would start. It would start cooking. Again, because you're starting with dry material, and you're burning the smoke as well, so there's very little pollution coming out of it. So biochar is available in bulk. Buying it in super sacks, tractor trailer style. It is available in smaller quantities as well, especially if you find a local supplier. The quarter is there for size comparison, and that the smaller the particle size, the greater the surface area. And most studies show that the greater the surface area, that's what you're looking for higher quality, higher performance chars. Just two projects that we've done with organic mechanics. In the interest of time, we'll just look at the pretty pictures for a minute and then move on. But that's 30 Rock in New York City. That's Split Rocker is the sculpture. There's biochar that we put in that soil for performance issues. And then on the left is outside the Kimmel Center in Philadelphia as a pop-up garden, and there's biochar in that soil as well. So the summary, biochar can modify physical, chemical, and biological properties of soil. It's going to have the greatest effect on poor soils, but still will benefit all soils. And the characteristics of the char will directly influence the plant soil benefit. I've said it many times, not all biochars are created equal. Same thing goes for all the soil amendments. You have to know your source, have that conversation, and make sure you know what you're getting. And of course, the other things I know you all can read, it's going to increase your water retention in dry soils, increase drainage in heavy soil, and it is permanent. So that last tree in the world, still standing. Morgan is perhaps taken down, but yeah, hopefully we don't ever get to this point. And for more information about biochar, that first website, biocharinternational.org, that is the premier site you want to go to for that. So I highly recommend that website, just because there's so much information about char. And then the Terra Preta bioenergylist.org, great listserv, lots of information there. If you ever have any questions that you want to ask further, then feel free to email us or call the office anytime. But very much want to thank everyone for being with us today. And I know we're going to have one more Q&A question time before we end.
Thank you so much, Mark. We just have one follow-up question about biochar, and that is, are there concerns that we need to understand with biochar? If you're adding carbon at such a high rate, will the plant take up less carbon out of the air?
Good question. Remember, the amount that we want in the soil is near 5% by volume. So that is not going to affect the amount of CO2 taken out of the air by the plant in a negative direction. It's only going to enhance and increase the amount of CO2 that the plant is taking out of the air, because biochar has been shown to improve yield and plant growth. More growth means the plant is working harder, taking energy from the sun, convert that CO2 into sugars to use within the plant. So if anything, biochar use in the ground will increase the amount of CO2 that trees are sequestering in their own growth.
Thank you so much for helping us sort through all of these amendment issues, as well as the biochar. This has been very helpful, I'm sure, to all of our listeners. So thank you all for participating, and good day and good gardening to you all.